Egypt's foreign minister urges rapid deployment of an international force to monitor the Gaza ceasefire. Qatar's prime minister says talks to solidify the US-backed Gaza truce have reached a critical moment. And Arab foreign ministers reject any attempt to force Palestinians out of Gaza via Rafah. It's 4 p.m. Cairo local time. I'm Rehan Morsi, and this is the first transmission of the day with the news bulletin, starting with Egypt's foreign minister urging the rapid deployment of an international ceasefire monitoring force under the second phase of the Gaza peace deal. Speaking at the Doha Forum, Foreign Minister Badr Abdel said the next phase should include moving quickly to deploy an international ceasefire monitoring force in Gaza. He also warned that Egypt's Rafah crossing will not be used as a gate for displacement, stressing Egypt's rejection of any attempt to force Palestinians from their land as efforts continue to stabilize the ceasefire and expand humanitarian access. Qatar's prime minister says negotiations to consolidate the US-backed Gaza truce are at a critical moment as mediators push to move the next phase forward. Speaking at the opening of the Doha Forum, Qatar's prime minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani said talks are at a critical stage, with mediators working together to advance the next phase of the ceasefire. In the same session, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said negotiations on the Gaza Stabilization Force are still underway, including its mandate and rules of engagement. He said the force's core role should be to separate Israelis and Palestinians along the border. At the Doha Forum, the EU sought to reassure transatlantic ties, while Qatar said the Gaza ceasefire will not be complete without an Israeli withdrawal. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaya Kallas said that the United States remains Europe's main ally, downplaying concerns after a new US national security strategy criticized European institutions. Separately, Qatar's Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani said the nearly 2-month-old ceasefire in Gaza will not be complete until Israeli forces withdraw from the Palestinian territory, as outlined under a peace plan backed by Washington and the United Nations.
We are still the biggest ally, and it's in the interest of the United States as well that Europe lasts and that we are really
Foreign ministers from several Arab and Muslim countries have rejected any attempt to force Palestinians out of Gaza through Rafah after Israeli remarks about opening the crossing in one direction only. In a joint statement, ministers from Egypt, the UAE, Jordan, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar voiced concerns at Israeli comments suggesting Rafah should be open one way to move Gaza residents into Egypt. They rejected any forced displacement and called for adherence to U.S. President Donald Trump's plan, saying it requires Rafah to remain open in both directions to ensure freedom of movement, support reconstruction, and allow Palestinians to remain on their land. The statement also stressed maintaining the ceasefire, ensuring unrestricted humanitarian access, and creating conditions for the Palestinian Authority to resume responsibilities in Gaza. Ireland Prime Minister is defending RTE's decision to withdraw from Eurovision, linking the move to solidarity with journalists killed during the Gaza war. Speaking at the British-Irish Council Summit in Cardiff, Michael Martin said RTE's withdrawal is an act of solidarity with journalists he said were killed in a breach of international humanitarian law during the Gaza war. Northern Ireland First Minister Michelle O'Neill backed the decision, saying countries should take action that sends a very strong message.
The war in Gaza. Without those journalists, the world would not have known to the degree that it knows the horrors.
Palestinians protested in the West Bank village of Beit Laid over what they say is an attempt by settlers to establish a new outpost. Palestinians say protesters gathered in the village as Israeli forces deployed during a demonstration against a planned settler outpost. A local official said settlers have been trying to bring in materials including wood, tents and other supplies. He warned the site is in an area classified as Area B and said the move sets a dangerous precedent. China is urging the international community to confront what it calls the root causes of the Palestinian cause after the UN General Assembly adopted several Palestinian-related resolutions. China's deputy UN ambassador told the General Assembly that the Palestinian cause is at the core of the Middle East issue and a test of international fairness and justice. He said China supports the Palestinian people's legitimate national rights and will continue humanitarian and development assistance. The envoy called for a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire in Gaza, improved humanitarian conditions and reconstruction under the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine. Several General Assembly resolutions covering UNRWA aid for Palestinian refugees and the occupied Palestinian territories were adopted, with the United States and Israel voting against related measures. For more in-depth analysis, we now move to Mark Summers in our newsroom. To you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Riham. Yes, we're joined now from Cairo by the managing editor of Al Ahram weekly newspaper, Khaled Dawood. Thank you very much for being here with us on Qnews. Let's talk about this ceasefire monitoring force, shall we? What do you think Egypt's vision is for the mandate and size and command of any ceasefire monitoring force? And how quickly do you think it could deploy?
Well, thanks, Mark, for having me again. I think it's this kind of Egyptian vision comes amid the increasing calls for moving towards the so-called second stage of the Trump plan after the release of all the Israeli hostages and including those who were deceased, except for one so far. And the repeated Israeli violations of this ceasefire agreement. Now we hear from Egypt as well as all other countries from the Arab and Muslim world that met with U.S. President Donald Trump that it's about time to move to the second stage, which is going to witness further withdrawals from the Gaza Strip by the Israeli occupation forces and the deployment of this international force mainly in order to monitor the adherence of the Israeli side in particular to the ceasefire agreement and to provide protection for the Palestinian civilians who continue to suffer tremendously despite the fact that nearly 2 months have passed since the ceasefire took place. We are seeing many worrying reports, the continued pressure by Israel to forcibly displace the Palestinian people, and I'm sure you've been following the recent kind of dispute over the understanding of the reopening of the Rafah crossing, where the Israeli side is stating that they would only open it one way for Palestinians to leave out of Gaza, and Egypt immediately reacted to this by stating that the Trump plan openly calls for Palestinian people's right to remain on their land, and if Rafah crossing was to open, and it should have opened a long time ago, it should be two ways. There are thousands of Palestinians waiting outside to go back home, and the deployment of this international force that the Trump plan calls for will also allow the reopening of the crossings and bring an end, hopefully, to the repeated Israeli violations of the ceasefire agreement, which have been taking place on a daily basis. I mean, Israel and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has been seeking to impose a vision of this ceasefire whereby if any alleged violation takes place, he goes on and orders his army to carry out wide-scale strikes, killing tens of Palestinians. This definitely needs to come to stop. Humanitarian aid has to flow, and the establishment of this force, along with the Board of Peace, which is also another expected step before the end of the month, if we believe the reports coming out of Washington, that would be very important signs towards moving to the second stage and to prove that this ceasefire agreement is not simply about the release of Israeli detainees held by Hamas in Gaza.
Yeah, you mentioned Rafah there. How important is it that Egypt manages to ensure that the Rafah crossing remains open in both directions for aid and also for movement as well, and whilst blocking any attempt at forced displacement?
Well, it's a kind of part of an overall comprehensive plan. I mean, this will not be possible to happen except if Israel withdraws fully from the Gaza Strip, as well as from the so-called buffer zones. Because, as you know, in the Trump plan, unfortunately, there is a reference that Israel will maintain some presence in border areas between Gaza and Egypt on one side and Israel on the other side. But this should be according to an international monitoring system along with the European Union, and at a time when there is a local Palestinian governing body, where the so-called bureaucratic government or technocrat government that would only serve the interests of the Palestinian people, and they should take care of the crossing and the passage of Palestinians. There is no question, Mark, that the Israeli Prime Minister wants to continue to occupy Gaza. They want to, the so-called yellow line that separates between the areas under Hamas control and those that remain under Israel's occupation, they want to make it permanent, and Israelis always want to keep a free hand to move within Gaza, controlling, of course, the borders as well, and that's not something that Egypt and the Arab and Muslim nations would accept. And I'd like to note, Mark, in this respect, that the debate over the Rafah crossing and Egypt's firm stand that it will not allow any Israeli schemes to forcibly displace Palestinians was supported by all Arab and Muslim nations that attended the meeting with Trump, which gives a kind of lone sign for the entire ceasefire taking place right now. I'm talking about Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Turkey. I mean, all those nations, they backed up Egypt's stand on this, that Rafah should be open two-way, not just one way. And we've also seen important statements from a country like France yesterday also stressing and supporting the joint statement issued by Arab and Muslim nations, whose cooperation is extremely vital and important to make this plan succeed. There would not be a board of peace, there would not be an international stabilization force if those Arab and Muslim nations continue to see massive Israeli violations and refusal to withdraw from Gaza. And that's why we heard from Mr. Abdel Ati, the Egyptian foreign minister, today in Doha, stressing the need to immediately deploy this international force and to move to the second stage.
Yeah, indeed, and with talks reportedly at a critical moment, are there concrete steps that mediators should be taking, perhaps this week, to lock in timelines, verifications, access for the next phase?
Well, Mark, I mean, like everybody knows, this is a U.S.-led process, and that's, to be honest with you, I mean, it's part of the problem, because we have seen the U.S. tolerance of the Israeli violations and strategy of imposing a status quo of the right to respond on a massive scale whenever there is an alleged violation. And this, like the United States, remains silent on those kinds of violations, at least the least to say, at least publicly. We haven't seen any statements condemning Israel's killing of Palestinians in Gaza over the past 2 months in alleged retaliation for alleged violations. And we haven't seen similar U.S. positions, clear ones, on Israeli violations in Lebanon or in Syria, at least publicly. Maybe behind closed doors it's a different situation. But again, there are reports coming out from Washington that President Trump is about to form this so-called board of peace, including at least 10 countries, forming of the other governing bodies, the formation of the local Palestinian technocratic government. These are all many challenges, and we cannot but wait and see for the coordination. But I'm sure that the Arab and Muslim nations led by Egypt and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE, along with Turkey and others, they are in direct contact with the U.S. administration and making it clear that they want this plan to succeed, but this will not be possible except if Israel withdraws from the Gaza Strip and links the Gaza Strip to the West Bank under the sponsorship and the leadership of the Palestinian Authority as a pathway to lead the independent Palestinian state. Without this, and that's, what hopefully is going to happen, although it seems to be lacking in the U.S. vision, that there is a need for a long-term strategy to lead to a Palestinian state, because a two-state solution, according to everybody, is what's going to make any peace permanent, and otherwise we'll continue to see those repeated wars and expansionist Israeli policies in the West Bank as well as Gaza. Because if you note, Mark, the statements made by Mr. Badr Abdel Ati in Qatar today, he also expressed the need for a similar observation force in the West Bank, because this right-wing extremist government is committing massive violations in the West Bank against Palestinians in terms of displacement, expansion of settlements, and there is a need to provide protection for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem as well.
Yes, you mentioned Turkey there, and Turkey says the force should separate Israelis and Palestinians along the border. How does that align with Egypt and Qatar's priorities, and also with the UN's plans?
Well, there is an obvious kind of disagreement over the role of the so-called International Stabilization Force. For Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the sole role of this force is to disarm Hamas. And that's going to be the cliche that we are going to be hearing repeatedly in the coming weeks if we move to the second stage, as an excuse which Netanyahu is going to use to delay further Israeli withdrawals. While from the Arab and Muslim side, you're mentioning Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they want to provide protection for Palestinian civilians after suffering a horrific war for 2 years. And everybody agrees that the effort needed to carry out reconstruction in Gaza after what Jared Kushner himself, the key U.S. negotiator, described that Gaza was nearly nuked. It was like destroyed, flattened. So there is a massive need for, international contributions, the reconstruction effort, and this is not going to happen if the war situation continues on the ground, and if the Israelis believe that the role of this international stabilization force is to provide protection for Israelis and to carry out their dirty work. And that's probably one of the obstacles. The international stabilization force, if Egypt, Turkey, the Israelis do not want Turkey, but if Egypt, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, you name it, I think any country in the world who would like to contribute forces would not see its role as occupying Gaza or act as an occupation force instead of the Israelis, because the role is to assure Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, providing this massive scale need for reconstruction and to build up on this political map that I spoke about in terms of linking Gaza to the West Bank and establishing an independent Palestinian state. So that's why, Turkey and Egypt, for the first time probably, Mark, we see this desire on behalf of Arab and Muslim nations to deploy an international force in Gaza and in the West Bank as a way to provide much needed protection for the Palestinian people in Gaza and occupied Palestinian territory.
And to that end, let's come to the European Union. What role should the EU play now when it comes to monitoring, funding reconstruction, and also, of course, supporting Palestinian authorities?
The European role, Union role is very important, but mainly in putting pressure on the United States to carry out its commitments. And as Mr. Badr Abdel Ati, the foreign minister, said today, carrying out the plan of Trump in its entirety, and not just the articles that are related to Israeli security concerns in terms of disarmament of Hamas. So, the European Union, I think, in my opinion, played a very important role in putting pressure on Washington and the Trump administration following the recognition of the independent Palestinian state by key European countries. I'm talking about France, I'm talking about Spain, and of course the UK, United Kingdom, although it's not a member of the EU currently, but of course it continues to play a very important role in Europe. So those kinds of pressures are important, but let me state very clearly and to be, honest about this. Without a stable ceasefire in Gaza, and we won't be able to speak about serious reconstruction in the Strip. And you've seen yourself, Egypt was supposed to host a conference on the reconstruction of Gaza by the end of November. But if we continue to be in a state of war, it's very difficult to hold this conference. So Egypt wants to hold this conference in cooperation with Europe, in cooperation with the Trump administration, so that work can start. But the main obstacle, and to be very honest, particularly in an election year in Israel, we cannot expect but obstacles and excuses and violations by this current Israeli government. And I personally, among those who believe that it's going to be very difficult to bring this current extremist, fanatic government in Israel with people like Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and even Netanyahu himself to commit to a long-term process and not simply using Palestinian blood as a kind of a campaigning method as elections are coming closer in Israel.
So what should we look forward to seeing over the coming days and weeks before the end of the year?
Well, Merry Christmas, early Merry Christmas. But, this kind of, we're talking about the American administration's agenda. So we're talking about, a matter of 2 to 3 weeks maximum before we hear about the formation of if it's going to happen and if it's going to take place. There's definitely a lot of negotiations happening behind closed doors. Egypt is playing a vital role in coordination with other Arab countries and in coordination with Hamas as well. Hamas delegation, they come to Egypt, they talk to the Egyptian the side, and we try to unify the Palestinian position in relation to the upcoming technocratic government. So these are all steps that we're waiting for. But, hopefully it's going to be a happy Christmas if we see this board actually formed, if we see the formation of the International Stabilization Force with a clear mandate, because I'm sure behind the closed doors, a lot of discussion is happening, as you mentioned earlier, about the size of this force, where it's going to be deployed. The Israelis, they want it to be deployed only in the areas under their control to provide the protection, but I don't think that this is what Arab and Muslim countries would, agree to do. So these are all important details, and I assume it's already been 2 months, these subjects under discussion. But if things go on the positive side, you're going to see some announcements on this issues, the three matters, the border fees, the International Stabilization Force, and the transitional Palestinian technocratic government. If this happens, before Christmas, that would be very important steps towards moving to the second stage and bringing the Israeli government to respect those parts of the plan. Or, as I mentioned, they've been using the issue of the Israelis' deceased detainees among Hamas to delay the implementation and of the rest of the agreement. Right now, there are no practical excuses for this Israeli government. Of course, they continue to speak about the remaining one Israeli body, but I don't think that from the perspective of the U.S. administration, Europe, Arab nations, and Muslim nations, there are any reasons to delay further the moving to the second stage or to continue these daily Israeli violations, not just in Gaza, Mark, but it's in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria. And you can see how this Israeli government is basically pushing the region towards further confrontation instead of complying to the desire of the majority, of the massive majority of the world to see restoration of stability and peace in this volatile region.
Well, thank you very much. That was Managing Editor of Al Ahram weekly newspaper, Khaled Dawood. Thank you very much for joining us here on Q News. And it's back to you, Raham.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we move on to Syria's interim president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, saying Israel's push for a demilitarized zone in the country's south is putting Syria in a dangerous position as Israeli forces continue operations in the area. Speaking at the Doha Forum, al-Sharaa warned that efforts to impose a demilitarized zone in southern Syria could deepen instability and raise the risk of escalation. His comments come as Israeli forces keep up activity in the south in what Israel describes as measures tied to its security. Damascus has repeatedly rejected any steps that undermine Syrian sovereignty and has urged the international community to press for an end to violations and a de-escalation on the ground. A UN Security Council delegation has toured southern Lebanon border areas, including UNIFIL headquarters and sites hit by Israeli bombardment. Footage showed the delegation traveling in convoy through the south, visiting UNIFIL's base and inspecting damaged areas along the border. The visit comes amid continued tensions and renewed warnings of escalations, even as international efforts focus on reinforcing calm and preventing further deterioration on the ground. The U.S. ambassador to NATO has said Russia and Ukraine are closer than ever to reaching a peace deal.
I think we are trying to end this war in Ukraine, and oftentimes, you don't go into butcher shop halfway when the sausage is being made and complain that you don't like the looks of the sausage. So I feel like we're all on the same page. With Secretary Rubio involved in the process, I'm fairly confident that all perspectives will be considered. But at the same time, we need to find if there's a deal that can even be made. I think it's been pretty clearly communicated that whatever was in the 28-point plan, that there are now 4 different streams. There's the NATO work, there's the EU work that have been separated out from the Russia-Ukraine peace process and the U.S.-Ukraine conversations, and those are all happening in real time.
Washington says the U.S. and Ukraine have held what it calls constructive talks on credible pathways to a lasting and just peace. The U.S. State Department says President Donald Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, met Ukrainian officials, including Ukraine's lead negotiator, in 2 days of talks. The discussions reviewed outcomes from recent U.S.-Russia meetings and explored steps to end the war. The two sides agreed on a framework for security arrangements and discussed deterrence capabilities, while Ukraine reiterated that any solution must guarantee independence and sovereignty. Washington said further meetings were scheduled for today and stressed progress depends on Russia showing a tangible commitment to long-term peace. That brings us to the end of our news bulletin, but before we wrap up, here's a quick recap of today's top stories making headlines for this hour. Egypt's foreign minister urges rapid deployment of an international force to monitor the Gaza ceasefire. Qatar's prime minister says talks to solidify the US-backed Gaza truce have reached a critical moment. And Arab foreign ministers reject any attempt to force Palestinians out of Gaza via Rafah. That brings us to the end of our news bulletin. For more stories and live updates, follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok using the handle @QNewsEGY to stay informed. Thank you for watching.